So I have a special guest on Grail Country today. I have Matthew Millner. Matthew Millner has a PhD in art history. He also has a seminary background, and he's written a book that is somewhere like in the nexus of art history, but also touches on theology. It's called Mother of the Land. This is the
Woo!
book.
You have it. I love it.
I have it. I've read it. And so we're going to talk about his book today, but we've kind of agreed that we'll also let the conversation go where it goes, and I think that's appropriate, given what the subject of his book is. So, you want to go ahead and give a high-level overview of what you were trying to accomplish in your book, Matt?
Absolutely. And I'm a longtime listener, first time caller here. So I'm a fan of Grail Country, and it's just so exciting. We were just chatting. I remember kind of sitting in my garage reading Tom Berg Meditation on the Tarot. I'm thinking I'm the only person in the world that has worked through this whole thing. And I mean, it was a strange experience because I read it in the same spot. And I got like, there were points at which I almost felt like he was with me, and I'm like, oh, this book is big. Like, and so I'm going through it. And I'm like, and there's only a few people that I could say like, hey, if I got to know someone well enough, I'm like, by the way, there's this amazing book, but nobody knew about it. Then I find out you guys are kind of you're bringing it all to the YouTube conversations. I'm like, my gosh, what a wild time we live in, where horrible, creepy things can be made accessible to everyone, but amazing, beautiful conversations that once might have happened in the shadows can be brought into the light. So I'm particularly grateful for your work, Nate, and glad to be here to have this conversation.
Yeah, both my priests knew about my YouTube channel too.
Hey, there we go.
So, and some of they had watched some of my content, but we're going to be having a new rector soon, so we'll see how that goes.
So when you say both priests with the same church,
yeah, we actually had, so the guy who was our deacon when I started, he ended up becoming ordained as a priest while I was attending, so he became like the assistant rector and was also a priest. And
Anglican, Orthodox,
Anglican. I'm Anglican.
Okay,
yeah. And we lost both of them within a very short period of time. Father Jeremy, who was originally a deacon when I first started attending, he felt the calling to go into the Army chaplaincy because he was a veteran and he had been in the Army, so he pursued that. So, and then Father John Allen, our other priest, he is taken on a congregation in Texas and moved all the way across the country. So we're looking for a new rector.
Oh, it is. Well, it's an exciting time, and all this stuff, a lot of it is bubbling up from the Anglican tradition in particular. I know you kindly asked me about my book, and some people might be interested in that, but I want to say real quick, a friend that I've recently been able to spend a lot of time with, I was stunned to realize that Malcolm Guite, and you're kindred spirits with him in a lot of ways, that he is undergoing the project of actually recasting the entire Arthurian saga, the Grail legend, in verse form. Did you know about this?
Yeah, I did.
I mean, and he told me this Take Up the Tale poem where he just felt the land summoning him to recast this legend for our time, in some senses wrenching the legend back from perhaps more xenophobic concerns and bringing it into the open view of an international Grail legend that it really has always been. So all this to say,
I know, but I mean, I can't not comment on that, because I think that's ultimately, like, that's what our mutual friend Michael Martin, I think that's what he's doing too, right? He may not specifically be taking up the motif of the Grail, but I really think that ultimately Sophia and the Grail are ways of talking about the same thing.
Right. And I really like Michael's essay drawing upon Bulgakov's Grail myth. His recasting the Grail myth is the earth as the Grail, right?
Yes.
And the Grail, and a couple of other Grail riffs here, because trust me, it will lead immediately into kind of a précis of the book. But I think one of the neglected treasures is Robert Johnson's book, He. And do you know the history of this book?
No, I don't. I
It,
noticed it in your footnote several times,
oh,
though.
the potency of this little gem. So basically, you had the great generation of Christian Jungians who just kind of fixed the problems and just said, okay, come on. When he says there's evil in God, he's just projecting his own issues onto God. He got over that. You should too. That is the Christian Jungians. And then all the purist Jungians got offended at that and tried to turn it into a purely pagan system, which for Jung it never was. Nevertheless, Robert Johnson is in this circle of the Christian Jungians. And John Sanford, an Episcopal priest in a great tradition of healing ministry, his mother was involved, and it was just astonishing family. Sanford invites Johnson over because, of course, Johnson was analyzed by Jung, right? That they had that connection, which is why people were so jealous of Johnson's popularity, because not only was he not the academic footnoted Jungian, but he also studied with Jung, right? Had those deep encounters. So Sanford invites Johnson over. Hey, could you give a little riff on Parsifal, right? And he says, sure, I'll give some talks. So surreptitiously he records them, and then has an administrator at the church type them up, and it becomes a bestseller known as He, and then he follows it up with She, and then We. These are disarmingly powerful.
Oh, it sounds like something I absolutely need to read.
But you can burn through He in an afternoon, and it just basically gets to, let's read Chrétien d'Artois, the core, earliest, most archetypal, he would say, right, version of the Grail legend. Maybe not the best version. We could get into those details, but nevertheless the earliest. And let's connect it to human psychology, masculine psychology in particular, but not in a weird way, in a very good way. And it's staggering. And you can get, Jung never touched it because it was Emma's domain. So he's like, I can't do Grail legend, even though I had the Liverpool dream and I know it's important and everything, but that's my wife's work, right? And so, I mean, of all the things Emma put up with, I'm glad at least he gave that to her. And so yeah, let's not forget this about Carl. And he gave that project to her, and she produced that wonderful Grail volume, where it's the kind of the Jungian early take on let's put all these myths together. But I really feel like as almost academic and helpful as that volume is, it's Johnson who really just gets to the heart of it. So with this understanding of the Western kind of map of the psyche, right, and not just for men, it's for women as well, and which is what Johnson went on to show. But what you have here is, in my book, is it really an attempt to kind of come in on that conversation, saying, let's look how it really went down. Okay, so it's nice to have the mythological contours in your mind, but at the end of the day, we're talking about real Christians with real swords fighting other real Christians, and subjugating them violently. And I'm not saying that because I don't believe in the archetypes and I don't believe in a rich, robust human psychology. I can do that, right? I'm saying, but I also don't want to forget that all of this stuff is being realized and people are actually dying. And the Crusades, as I in graduate school, I was just at the time where the beating up on the Crusades school had expired, and all of these incredible scholars were explaining, you have to understand the Crusades on their own terms. You have to understand these as legitimate defensive missions, as it wasn't just the second son seeking to get his inheritance and grumpy because he didn't have any money and going off to kill people and come back with jewels. It was more complicated than that, and I'm grateful for those scholars. But I kind of turned the corner after that, and I said, yeah, but at the end of the day, were these actually successful? Like, were these a good idea? And so the idea was to take all the wisdom of the Western Grail tradition, but then try to look at it from the Orthodox point of view, where you have all these Grail legend inspired people coming at you to conquer your island and use you as a cash cow to try to take Jerusalem unsuccessfully. And so I sort of spin it around and say, what was it like from the Orthodox end to experience these Grail inspired warriors, right? And at the end of the day, we've got to be careful here, because I think the best case for Chrétien d'Artois and others is they're actually tweaking these crusaders. They're saying if you discover these internal riches, the kingdom of heaven is within you. You won't have to go on a literal mission, right?
Yeah.
And so anyway, all that to say, I'm not trying to throw the whole Western Grail legend under the bus, but I want to tell the side from the Orthodox point of view. And insofar as one can imagine what that would have been like in the 12th century. And so I find a person, not a fictitious invention, I mean, an actual named human, Theodore Absevdis, who's an Orthodox icon painter, as important as Andrei Rublev, as important as Giotto, right? A actual identifiable name in the Orthodox, in all of art history, people should say. And there was Raphael, but long before that, there was Theodore Absevdis. And so I tell the story of his creation of a protesting icon that is a grail of sorts, because Mary is so Eucharistic in this image, and it responds to the aggression of the Western Crusaders with suffering love. And again, it might just be of antiquarian interest. Okay, fine, whatever. But it becomes a blockbuster of art history, and it is everywhere. I mean, when I say everywhere, I like to tell people, wherever you are, just put Our Lady of Perpetual Help into a search engine, into a map. You'll find a church nearby. And if you haven't, I've been in some places where I haven't, I've usually found one anyway.
I've seen it in every Catholic home I've ever been in.
Exactly. And that's the thing. So my crisis was, I was in Charlottesville, and that's what's nice. It's Catholic, but it's also Orthodox for reasons I get into in the book. But I was in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I was there to finish the book. I was kind of part of a fellowship thing at University of Virginia, and I was like, I can't find a Virgin of the Passion, and this is ruining my whole thesis, right? My whole shtick is she's everywhere, and here I am in Virginia, and the closest church was like 60 miles away. I'm like, that doesn't count. That's cheating. And so I'm looking all over this town for an example of this icon of suffering love that is a response to the Crusades, sort of your post-Christendom icon. And I'm almost coming up empty, but I just intuitively knew, like, I'm not going to come up empty here. and I kid you not, I saw like the Jefferson and Lee statues smashed. It was still, they were fresh kills, so to speak. They had just taken them down. It was not too long after the riots. I met the mayor during the riots. Like, I mean, it was still such a fresh memory when I was there, and the Unite the Right stuff. And then I stumbled into a 2020 construction Catholic church. And I'm like, she's going to be here. And I looked in this whole sanctuary and nothing. And I was about to leave in a dejected way. And then I did what art historians always do, is they make church custodians nervous. They make museum guards nervous. I always poke around. And so I've been yelled at many times. And escorted out of places. And so I just burst through a door uninvited, and I found an entire chapel that had just been constructed with a beautiful Our Lady of Perpetual Help. I'm like, yeah, I was like, she's everywhere. All this to say. So this icon is all over the place. She's in Avengers movies.
Maybe she needed to be more present in that particular place.
I know. If she was there, maybe we wouldn't have the problem. And that's what, Johnson's point. And he's a little bit too of a dot your I's and cross your T's Jungian to, it is the anima. And he is actually a little suspicious about the Virgin Mary, because he thinks if you conflate the Sophia and the Beatrice in the Virgin Mary figure, that you actually do some damage. And so he has this theory of the double anima. And I'm like, I'm okay. I don't need to parse it that way. Right. I can let these images be fluid. And so I'm not as concerned about the Virgin Mary as he is. He had a bad situation. He was in Los Angeles once, and he was trying to work out some things, and he poured out his soul before a statue of the Virgin Mary at the Junipero Serra Church there in the heart of the city. I've been to it myself. And he said after he did that, he just saw a little neon glow, and he noticed that it was not real candles, it was fake. And he just felt utterly betrayed. And he said, I'll never do that again. So all this to say, Johnson's an interesting figure in this regard. Yeah. I have not been so disillusioned in regard to the wildly important great symbol of the Virgin Mary in the Christian tradition. And as we know, thanks to Michael Martin, is that he has done so much work to mine what we should all realize, which is that when everyone gets all excited about, oh, Sergius Bulgakov, the greatest Orthodox mind of the 20th century, like, no question, but he got it all from us, right? From Jakob Burma, from the Lutheran tradition, from the Anglican tradition, from William Law, who brings that in. And I'm not saying that to say that we have all the answers and the Orthodox tradition doesn't. I'm just saying at the end of the day, we've realized this wonderful ecumenical exchange that has been taking place, and I'm just no longer embarrassed about the Protestant tradition, because I know this.
If anything is going to unify the church, it's Our Lady.
Isn't that?
And you've stumbled on that.
And she has unfortunately, it's not her, it's perceptions of her have divided the church.
Yes.
And we're all, and we can debate that at length. And we should bring in an Orthodox and a Catholic person to keep us honest. Where you and I were going to go on our exploit our Anglican liberties in this regard. Malcolm Guite told, well, really, come on, you Protestants, you just rip down images of the Virgin Mary. I love that. As long as that perception survives, I'm going to continue to enjoy myself as an art historian, because I almost count on that misperception, and then it was a barrel, gun, fish.
Yeah.
And I just show image after image in my classes of a Puritan fishmonger in the 1600s in England with a huge tree of Jesse with the Virgin Mary in his home. And everyone's like, huh? And then I show a picture of a glorious Virgin Mary being stripped out of a beautiful cathedral. And everyone's like, oh, who? Those Protestants? And I'm like, no, those are the Catholics in 1506 in Siena. They did it because they saw that she was getting idolatrous. I know of so many acts of iconoclasm in Catholicism. It's called the Second Vatican Council. Have you been in a church lately? You get the idea. I have my admiration and love for Vatican II and for those wonderful documents. But we've all been in churches where we're like, what happened to the Virgin Mary? I remember spending all this time in New York I don't even want to bring it up because it's so painful to people, but there's just amazing, beautiful churches that then, there would be a successful priest there for a while, and then another priest would come in and they'd whitewash the icons. And it's just like, we have to stop this Reformation food fight, as Richard Rohr likes to call it. And I know he's not as careful of a thinker as we want, but he really does get some things right. And he's right about that. We just have to stop hurling food at each other and say that at the end of the day, Vatican II was a huge dethronement of Mary, and maybe a Protestant would celebrate that, but I think there's a lot of Catholics that lament it. The great single one-book response to that is Charlene Spretnak's Missing Mary. It is a truly magnificent book. She comes from the goddess movement, and without ever saying, like, I'm returning to Catholicism, she's a little soft, but she basically is like, I have found what they were looking for in this incredible figure, but you demoted her. You took so much of the power away from the Virgin in Vatican II. And so that's one thing you just have to just grapple with. I mean, there's a reason. I mean, the Catholic Church, gosh, I think we went too far. And that's the stuff that people accuse Protestants of. And yes, it's true. We did that too. I fully confess that. But what we now realize is this enormous tradition of all of this Mariology, stemming from Jakob Burma, stemming from these extraordinary figures through the Sophiological tradition that people like Arthur Versluis have mined and uncovered. They're all coming out of the Michigan mystics like Michael and Arthur. And it's just like, wow, all this stuff is there. So let's instead of having to brand one another, let's enjoy the feast and revel in this symbol, who's not just a symbol. She's an actual person, right? And let her presence in, she's not a theological idea. I say this to my students, like, this isn't just a theological game. Mary is a presence in the church. She's a presence in the church, right? Yeah. And in some senses, in the symbolic frame, she is the church. Not in the sense that the church, her body is where Jesus's body gestated. Every Christian has to believe that, or gets to believe that. Doesn't have to. It's like, it's true. Why wouldn't you believe it? And so if
Which
Jesus,
means that her womb is exactly the same as the Holy of Holies.
yes, and likewise, she could, if you and I, Nate and Matt, if Jesus is supposed to be being made more real in us, right? Paul says that I grieve because like a woman in childbirth, because Christ is not yet formed in you, right? Then therefore, the maternal matrix of the church, Marian matrix, is a perfect symbol for what happens in Christian maturation, which is why apses are shaped like wombs, right? It's just so, of course.
Oh yeah,
right?
I sent an email once to John Vervaeke, the cognitive scientist who's been on my channel before in conversation with Michael Martin and I actually said something, and I don't remember the context, but I do remember the line. I said that he asked me, I was answering a question about sophiology, and I said that we must also imitate Mary because we must also become a womb in which the Son of God is gestated within us. So we are equally called to imitate Mary. And this is what I said to John.
Well, okay. So first of all, about Vervaeke, just got to say, I remember listening to a conversation with him when he keeps talking about the love of Nicaea, right? The love of victory, versus the Christian love. And that's what this book is about, right? This book is I wanted to call it Our Lady of Losers, but it wouldn't have had the weight. But just, this is the what happens when you don't win. And in fact, I have the Nike of Samothrace in the book, and the corollary on the island of Rhodes, which is where the rock that made the Nike of Samothrace at the Louvre was mined, and where the naval victory that she was commemorating, that's where it happened. And then you have a version of the Passion on that island, and the very island of the Knights of Rhodes, who defended so valiantly against the Ottoman conquerors. So anyway, that's the whole. That I feel like if you're against if you want something more than Our Lady of Victory, of which there have been countless examples in Christian history, that this whole book is a response to that. Of like, so this is, in some senses, I hope that is of interest to him if he's interested in that. But you mentioned, I'm determined to go on as many tangents as possible for someone who's listening who might want to know what the book is about, so that they have to buy it. That's my goal.
That's fine.
So I'm gonna keep baiting you into tangents, but
we are still talking about themes in the book, though.
We are. They're all in there, exactly. So but yeah, there's just I love. You mentioned Vervaeke, but what did you mention after that, Nate?
Oh, the context was like this was like when I was in the middle of setting up the conversation with him and Michael, and I was having a back and forth with him about sophiology. Like that's what the context was, I believe.
Yeah, and so and in regard of the womb, and this is the kicker. So when it comes to Meister Eckhart, because of any Christian thinker, I mean, this idea of everyone functioning in a Marian capacity in Christianity. So I wrote a little article called, I didn't get to title it, but it was like What Men Can Learn from Mary in 2020. And I got a brief moment in the New York Times, and then the gates closed. So like, okay, I get one shot, it's over, right? So I got my article in there, but basically in that article, I strung together all of these thinkers from Christian history: Anglican, Catholic, Orthodox, Jeremy Taylor, Meister Eckhart, Simeon the New Theologian, just bam. Who all say that. So I strung the quotes together. And it's like, and I found an image of a Christian named Saint Minas in the town of Castoria in Greece. And it was this, he was like sitting here and he had Jesus within him and he's holding his hands up like this. And I'm like, oh my goodness, it's a Marian image.
There it is, right there in an image.
Right. And I saw it, and I snapped a picture. And I was like, what do I do with this? And the antiquarian interest in my field, they were like describing, well, who was Saint Minos and when, and that's fine. And tell me the pigment details of the paint. And I'm like, look, at the end of the day, this is a Marian male, and it's kind of interesting.
Right.
And so, the article went, I think, because it was interesting in that regard. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, like I found this image. And I think people were like, oh, you're a gender bender, or you think that masculinity doesn't matter. That's not true at all. I'm just saying that at the end of the day, we're brides, even if we're men, if you're in the body of Christ, because that's the other metaphor that Scripture prioritizes. And that's not because I don't believe in the goodness of male and female.
We're brides, but we're also still knights. We're all knights too. We're both.
The women are knights and the men are brides.
Yes.
And praise, and everyone gets, perhaps understandably concerned at that. And I say that from the anchor point, the anchor hold of knowing that genders as biological realities are not mere constructs. They are gifts. They are gifts, male and female. And it's because of my confidence in my location as a male, right, that I can celebrate and rejoice in what the Jungian would call the anima, right? But for me, it's not just a psychological element of myself that I've projected onto the tradition. No, it's I am not complete until I fully engage the feminine. And for me, there's some feminists, if you even say the feminine, you are somehow succumbing to this ideal that will necessarily dehumanize women. I just don't believe that at all. I don't believe that at all. I really think Michael's article in Jesus the Imagination, where he kicks off the divine feminine piece by saying, look, Simone de Beauvoir, who, by the way, is now perceived as hopelessly conservative by many of the radical feminists, right, he far prefers Julia Kristeva. He far prefers this idea. Yes, you're allowed to have these incredible ideals of what it means both to be male and female, and both genders require them for wholeness. Jung got at that. I think that's why there's so much holism. That's why you just never get tired of that system. But the Christian church takes it into the full and living color that it's meant to be. The Christian church adds an additional element. And that's why I begin the book with.
And I think in its artistic images is where it's most, where you can see it. Really.
Well, exactly. And that's why I think you should have a Virgin Marian child in your home. Why shouldn't you?
Yes, of course.
Like, what? How could you not? Anyway, come on, you're going to give that up to IKEA and have some, stupid New York City poster, even though you don't live in New York City. Come on. Anyway, you can't do that, I guess. But anyway, or have some sacred image from the variety of cloud of witnesses. Pick your cloud. Just have something in there. Anyway, all that to say, that's why I begin the book with the great quote from Tomberg, where he says she's not an egregore, an occult creation of, your wackiest, wildest occult person says, yes, the collective meditational force of these occult practitioners will generate this. He's like, no, she's not that. No. She's a person. She's a person. And she's definitely not a projection of my psyche. She's, and that there are elements of that, sure, but basically it shatters the Jungian glass. And the Jungian glass, arguably, Jung himself was getting bored of it at the end of his life, which is why he cites 1 Corinthians 13 at the end in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And we can go beyond him. He is an undeniably important conversation partner. He rectifies a massive deficit in the pastoral activity of the Christian church, both then and now, undeniably. There's no way around that.
Well, can you imagine how different? Let's say, imagine Jung had been born in the Middle Ages, like before all this rich symbolic language had been basically forgotten. He'd have been a different figure altogether.
Yeah, he wouldn't have had to press the alarm bell,
right,
or so aggressively. And the people, remember, he's in a Swiss context. There's no images in his church.
Right, exactly.
That's the problem. So that's why he has to come
up we can't blame Jung for, exactly, that's what I'm saying. We can't blame Jung for how it turned out. He's a product of his time and place and age. And he was seeing how it was deficient. Totally. And trying to bring something else into the conversation.
Completely. And he finds it, and he finds the men Christ gestating within men. He finds it in the peculiar figure Angelus Silesius. I've never said it out loud. I've just read it. He finds this medieval mystic from like his area, and he really sees, oh look, here's someone who's saying Christ must be born within you. But what I'm simply, I mean, I'm glad he found that, but there are endless sorts. I found it in Jeremy Taylor in our Anglican tradition. It's in the Bible, right? What I just said, the Christ being born in you, or Christ in you, the hope of glory, or the evangelical, I want to accept Jesus into my heart, right? There it is. Like, you are Marian when you do that. And again, in a metaphoric sense, you're not literally Mary. But just like you're not literally Christ, even though you're part of the body of Christ, unless you're walking around in a costume in Jerusalem, there are people who think they're literally Jesus. Anyway, but this is the kicker. And this is, I think, one of the most exciting things for anyone listening to pursue, is that the mother lode, pun intended, of this is in Meister Eckhart. And he just says it over and over and over and over again. It really is astonishing how frequent this motif comes up. Let's see if I can just do it off the cuff here. I've got this amazing, I have a wonderful book in my hand, Meister Eckhart and Divine Knowledge by C.F. Kelly, published in the 1979, I think. It continues to be just the academic tour de force that exonerates Eckhart of the kind of monistic heresy that he is still today accused of, and says all of this is on the shoulders of Aquinas. All of this is to be understood within a traditional Trinitarian Christian framework. And it's not this undermining that popularizers of Eckhart make him out to be.
Right.
But he says over and over again that Christ must be born in you in the same way that he proceeds from the Father. And you're just like, ugh. I mean, this is where people really get nervous. This is why he successfully defended himself, but in the heresy trials, but then he died before they could really get him. And this is the kicker. Now, I don't want to be territorial here, but I'm merely responding to people that constantly try to blow the whistle on the poverty of the Protestant tradition. Is that this is the thing. It's that Valentin Weigel, Weigel, he's the Lutheran who kept the Eckhartian tradition alive. What has happened in these wonderful new books, there's two massive, gorgeous, recently edited volumes on Protestant mysticism that essentially say there were all of these figures who took the Eckhart, Tauler, mystical strain of German unitive thought, which Luther translated and defended and said, I didn't make this up. When I say I'm in Christ in this mysterious way, I'm getting it from the Theologica Germanica, which he writes the preface to, this anonymous figure who speaks in these mystically unitive ways. This is not the Luther that most people know about. It's the mystical unitive Luther. And when you don't want to get all hung up on Luther, and then you add, so you've got Eckhart, Tauler, Theologica Germanica, prefaced by Luther to defend himself from Catholic attacks. And then you have Valentin Weigel, and then pushing onward, you have this Eckhartian strain in the Protestant tradition. And I don't say that because I have to have it be Protestant or else I'm not going to listen to it. I'm happy to avail myself of any riches wherever they appear. But it's interesting that people who say we have no unitive mystical tradition. I like to point out that when Thomas Merton was a 4-year-old, Evelyn Underhill was writing Mysticism. So let's not pretend that we were all just sitting here in dry, dull, dualistic consciousness until Thomas Merton. Oh, and then finally, come on, that's a caricature view that some people have. Thank God for Thomas Merton. But I also want to thank God for Evelyn Underhill. And then what's so funny about Evelyn Underhill is she has a Roman Catholic spiritual director, one of the most famous Catholics in England, Baron von Hugel. Of course, initially he wants her to convert to Catholicism. And then he's finally like, well, I don't know if that's what God has for you. And she says, yeah, I've determined that this is where God has called me to be. Believe it or not, she goes so far as to, she never said this publicly, but in a letter written to someone, she's like, well, should I convert to Catholicism? She says, well, of course you should be drawn to the beauty of the Catholic Church. How could you not be? They're a place of prayer. That would be absurd if you weren't. But she said, at the end of the day, you are to aside from extraordinary circumstances, stay where God has placed you.
Mm-hmm.
And if Pusey and Keble had succumbed to the, she says it, spiritual laziness of John Henry Newman, I was like, I wouldn't say that, but she did. Then the Anglican Church would be in far worse position than it is now. But God would have raised up his prophets. And so she just, and again, Newman's an amazing figure, but she says that. And I love, my favorite line about Underhill is Bulgakov saw her at the one of the Fellowship of Saint Sergius. So they were at those gatherings. And he said, he's like, who is that little woman? She knows way too much. he recognized in her absolute genius. And I've just, and so my thing to just read Evelyn Underhill's Practical Mysticism. Mysticism itself, 1913, was an early adopter. Baron von Hugel helped her refine it. It went through successive strange editions, but really, I think Practical Mysticism is all of it. It's just right there. And the point is, I think that the mystic heals the wounds of the Reformation. That's what Teresa Lisieux teaches us, right? Even though the church, unfortunately, can't go public with that yet. Figures like Nouwen, Lisieux, Jacques Philippe all move toward a essentially grace-centered, almost downright Lutheran approach to things. It's grace all the way. And I know that horrifies people to say it, but I can show you the lines, right? It's all stuff that would have got them killed in the 16th century. We all know that. Carafa would have killed him. Carafa, who of course became the Pope and persecuted Michelangelo and Vittorio Colonna and all the spirituality who were influenced by Protestant ideas.
Yeah, Our Lady and mysticism are necessarily the things that are going to cause like unity in the church while maintaining its multiplicity, by the way. Because I don't think that the unity of the church is going to be, we're not going to like all be under the Pope again. That's not what's going to happen. It's going to be a different kind of unity. It's going to be a unity that respects the multiplicity of its expressions. And I think that necessarily happens both through mysticism and through Our Lady. And
no, I have to disagree. I think we do all need to be under the Coptic Orthodox Pope. But I'm joking.
No, that's a great point. That's really funny.
I do believe I believe the Petrine See will have a role in unity. I don't think that's going to go away, but it probably will have to be multinodal, as you're describing. I think you're right.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Do you have any more to say about that? About how you think the Petrine See will be involved in a potential future unity?
Yeah, I think that first, primus inter pares, right? First among equals. That seems to be part of the equation, and I think it's not, if the Pope would preach the gospel, I would kiss his feet, right? I think it's Melanchthon who says that, right? It's like, look, if we would just, and it's like, and that has happened to some extent. And you want to say, okay. And so I feel like redemption I am not of the opinion. What I think we need to do is we need a book that is profoundly influential with me in this regard. I commend it to everybody. I mean, it is something to contend with. It is Vince Bantu's A Multitude of Peoples. And he basically takes Philip Jenkins' notion of this, the lost history of Christianity, the Assyrian Church of the East, and he applies it to the Nubians, and he applies it to the Miaphysites, and he applies it across the board to these geographical locations, which are the reason we think of Christianity as a Western religion. And that book needed to exist, but no one had really done the onerous work of really catching up with where Syriac studies is today, where Nubian studies are today, but Vince did. And it's astonishing that someone could produce that text. So we now have it in our hands. And when you read that text, you really do get a sense of that multinodal sense. Jerusalem has to be the center of Christianity, not Rome. Rome is very important, but where did the first ecumenical council happen? It happened in Acts, right? And I love how Bede Griffiths, when he moves to India, he's like, yeah, we don't need Vatican III, we need Jerusalem II.
Right.
We need to get, be close.
The heavenly city is the new Jerusalem, not the new Rome.
Thank you. And that's the thing. And I want to say this, and I know it sometimes frustrates Catholics to hear this, but I just want to say this as a way of when I speak this way, I want to honor the great gifts that Rome has brought, and will continue to bring. Praise be to God. But I had the most astonishing experience just a week ago. And I say that not because it's just on my mind and I'm going to say it because we're on a podcast. I think I will be reflecting upon this for decades. I have long provoked my students into trying to go worship with the Assyrian Church of the East, because even though Marco Polo would have had to go to China and did to go worship with them, they are in Chicagoland because, of course, they've been mercilessly persecuted and their bishop comes here often. He was here this last summer, though he's seated in Baghdad. And so the Assyrian Christians, who are the vehicles, they're basically Syriac. Christian Syriac is the foundation of both the Islamic Golden Age. It wasn't the Muslims who kept all these Greek texts. It was the Syriac Christians did, and then the Muslims got it. And they're the foundation of any serious Buddhist who is going to get to their tradition as transmitted through Chinese. It was Christian Syriac translators who made that possible. So if you're into Zen or Pure Land Buddhism or any serious Buddhism, you can thank Assyrian Christians for making that possible. That's the point that Philip Jenkins makes in The Lost History of Christianity. Pretty interesting. So all this to say, so I know they're in my area, and I found I had an injury. I had to get an MRI, and I was like, oh, I don't want to do this. The only time they could schedule it on a Sunday. Got out of the MRI room, like, I couldn't go to church. We usually take our families to church, and I was like, this is it. I'm north. I was like near the place, and I got there just in time. It was all in Assyrian. And it was incense choked, gorgeous room. And I'm like, oh my gosh, they're here and I'm with them. And then I went outside, I was looking around because of course the sermon went on and on. I couldn't understand anything. And this guy caught my eye and he said, and I asked him, I said, thanks. I hope it's okay that I'm here. And he's like, you are welcome to be here. And he said, because he saw me go up and honor the cross, he said, and you are welcome to receive communion. And it was one of the most moving experiences I can remember, because what am I supposed to do? Say no?
Right.
I'm baptized. Now, you might say, right, but what about their Nestorian Christology? At the end of the day, Nestorius is not that important of a figure for them. Theodore of Mopsuestia is much more important. Nestorius is a minor figure, but they weren't represented at the Council of Ephesus. And they don't think that Mary is anthropotokos. They don't think that she's the mother of just a human being. It's just they weren't there for the conversation about Theotokos. And that's the Council of Ephesus that the Assyrian Church of the East never fully agreed with. But the problem was they were off preaching the gospel to Taoists and Buddhists, and they were not connected to the empire. And it wasn't that they were quote unquote heretics. It was that they weren't imperially represented. And in fact, to be imperially represented would have completely compromised their mission in Persia. That's Vince Bantu's point. And are we going to say they're not part of the Christian church? Now, and then the immediate, I hope a person, when they hear that, they would scratch their heads. Wait, but what about the doctrinal boundaries? And I've combed the documents of the Council of Ephesus in 431, which I concur with. Mary is the mother of God. That was necessary to be said in the place where Artemis was worshipped, right? Mm-hmm. And those documents say we are not adding a thing to the Nicene Creed, not a thing. We're not coming up with a filioque clause like they did in Toledo. All we're doing is just saying this is a point of clarification. So the Nicene Creed was still the anchor point. And so on that basis, I could worship with that and even receive communion. And so that is that international character of the body of Christ that has to be attended to. And is Rome capable of stretching itself to acknowledge that? It already has done so. May it do more. I don't think it's done enough yet, certainly not to acknowledge our tradition. We've got to work on that. And they might say, well, you're spinning off out of control. And well, so are you. If you look under the rocks and, typical Catholic, we're all in trouble. And we can only get out of this together. Yes. And we can only get out of this with mom.
Yeah, with mom. Exactly. With mom. That's right. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Oh, that's great.
So that's what the book's about. The book's trying to create this sort of ecumenical virgin, not created, acknowledge where it's already been
Acknowledge
there.
that. Yeah, right, exactly.
And this is the kicker. So, from the book, the hardcore Chalcedonian chapter, where I really go into the origin of this icon, is a very refined theological dispute over the tenets of Chalcedon, 451. And what I show is that this icon conceals and elucidates a strictly Chalcedonian theology, fully human, fully divine in the person of Jesus. And if that's the case, what's so beautiful is that I didn't have time to pursue this completely in the book, but the Miaphysite Christians, the Coptics, the Ethiopians, they all embrace this icon. And so here's the proposal. Has unity already been achieved in visual form? Mm-hmm. If we lay down our idolatrous, and I want to be careful there. If we lay down our sometimes calcified theological formulae and instead permit art history to do some work, then we can say, gosh, maybe the Holy Spirit through the medium of art has already unified the churches to a certain extent, because this particular icon that this book is about is both Coptic Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic.
And this is where John Vervaeke enters back into the conversation.
There we go.
Because
tell us how.
Because our interaction with art is an inherently participatory activity. We don't formulate propositions based on our interaction with art. When we know something artistically, it's more like knowing a person.
Totally.
It's more like knowing a person, and it is completely through our participatory knowing capacity. Mm-hmm. And that makes sense to me. That's where you would find the unity, is in the participatory expressions that are deeper than the propositional layer, where we fight about the dogmas.
Exactly. I love watching the discipline of philosophy. As my wife, a philosophy major, likes to remind me, you're not a good philosopher, and that's true. But I watch people whose minds naturally function in that analytic capacity, and I admire them. They are not me. I am not them. But I love it when they, at some point in their lives, you could almost set your watch to it, they'll discover art. And they're like, art is so amazing. Oh my gosh, what have I been doing in philosophy? I've discovered art. And I'm like, yeah, I know. We've been waiting for you. Welcome. Yeah. There's always more room at the art party for you. Yeah. Exactly. It's just so beautiful. And I think, and it's just, it's a wholeness of knowing. And I love this story, but we had these students at Wheaton, God bless them, who are preaching the gospel in Millennium Park. And I love that they do that. And I love that I live in a country where that's possible. But it's increasingly less possible because our country's tradition of religious liberty seems to be vanishing in certain sectors. And so they got told to stop. And they're like, I think I'm allowed to do this. And the people at Millennium Park, no, you're bothering people. Now, these aren't placard students. These are pretty just eloquent and gentle. Mm-hmm. And so they took the park to court and they won. And fine. And as I had a student of mine, a student who was going through this in class, and he was nervous. And of course he would be nervous. He's going to court. And I'm glad he did, right? And I said to him, let me tell you a little secret. At the end of the day, I was like, if you lose this, if you just learn your art history, you can do it anytime you want at the Art Institute of Chicago, just across the street. Right? Because you have the entire gospel is unfurled in that beautiful museum, and people are open to the art. Now, I'm not saying I'm some weird covert evangelist who's trying to, proselytize people. I'm just saying I'm unfurling for them the beauty that's in front of them, using the gift of painting and sculpture, and the psyche is open in a way it's not when you're simply addressing someone with verbal propositions. And when I was a grad student, you can complain about the secular Princeton University all you want, but I didn't care because I would lead tours of the Princeton University Chapel. They're still on the Office of Religious Life website. You can take them if you ever go to Princeton. Just pop the earbuds in and take. And I would just give these tours, and people, I would time it so that the end of the tour would be about 5 o'clock in the winter months, like in where the sun would burst through the west window of the Princeton University Chapel, the finest assemblage of stained glass in the Western Hemisphere, and people would weep.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't me. I was just,
Right.
and so secular university or not, I was just using the vehicle of art to convey that. And so that's sort of, I'm so glad to hear you say that, because for me as an art historian, it's like I've always kind of known that, and it's sort of where I live. And people,
Well, because I mean,
yeah,
the whole point of what we do as Christians is actual transformation, right? Like that's the
yeah.
and the art has always been capable of accomplishing that transformation without uttering a single word.
Isn't that the truth? And one of the things in the early Christian church was, if a pagan wants you to show them your faith or tell them about it, just show them the icon.
What?
It's pretty quick. Done.
Yeah.
Right. Anyway,
Right.
so and these museums are continuing to proclaim that reality, whether the museum labels clarify it or not.
Yeah. Amen.
So I hope this icon does some of that work,
Yeah.
and we've left it sufficiently elusive so that if people want to know more, well, they'll
Yeah.
it's in there.
Can you tell people where they're able to buy your book, and then I'll make sure to put links in the description too.
Oh, sure. Yeah, you can get it you can get it on Amazon. I mean, I'm sorry, should I not say that? Is that
No, that's fine.
Where
No,
fine books are sold today? So yeah, it's but yeah, and people, it's not color, and just, I mean, they're black and white images. They're good black and white images, but and so I saw a wonderful review of it. Someone posted and said, "Oh, I wish they were color." I'm like, yeah, but then it would be $75. And so that's the necessary to keep it in the 25, 23 range with the Amazon discount. That was and so that's the thing. I think it's a beautiful book. I had students help me, wonderful student help me with beautiful maps. And so the idea is I want people to be kind of taken into this story. But it is a story.
Yeah, it's a very readable book, I have to say.
Oh, good. I'm so glad to hear you say that.
It's a very readable book. It tells an interesting story. It kind of has like this sort of like detective story element to it that people will find interesting and engaging, and I highly endorse it.
Hey, Nate, thank you. That is so. You are the first to have with me to have podcasts, possibly the last, but at least it happened once. But sir, I deeply appreciate your saying that. This
Oh, Matt, this was a wonderful conversation. You're welcome back to Grail Country anytime.
I really look forward to that. There's too much to talk about.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thank you for joining me today.
You got it.